On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse, we have the return of Daniel, a survivor guest from June 2nd, 2024, and we discuss trauma, coping mechanisms, the healing process, honoring your authentic self, and finding joy in authentic experiences. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and with me today we have the return of Daniel. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Yeah, overall, I can't complain.
So, your episode was about you and your abusive dad, and you finally, coming to terms and understanding that you lived in abuse for a long time. And I remember from listening to you on the day that a lot of people are gonna feel like, oh, how did he not know? Because in a lot of instances, it's like it was plain as day, but it's just so when you're in it and this is your life and you've lived this your whole entire life, it's different. And it's hard for people that have never experienced something like that for them to understand. But you touched a chord with a lot of people. I got a lot of emails about you, that they resonated with a lot of stuff that went on in your story, and it was very helpful to them. And you reached out to me now to do like a follow-up of what has gone on in your life since then, what has opened up for you, what has changed. So with that being said, how are you doing? And tell us what's been going on and why you reached out.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for that introduction. And, it's really validating to hear just that. It resonates with a community feeling without even, speaking with anybody in that regard. Certainly, that's one thing I've learned on this journey of kind of recovery and rebuilding that, it's a very lonely process. And there are people out there, in very similar situations. I think one of the things I just want to say first of all is thank you again for that opportunity. I mean, I was at a very fragile place when I reached out, really, originally, that is, honestly looking to really anchor that newfound reality that was so destabilizing. Like you said, you don't even know you're in it and until you see it. And once that happens, it's extremely destabilizing.
Talking to you right now, I'm I'm getting the what's the best way to put it? It's sparking the memory of when I spoke to you. And now with like hindsight here, as you say, like I think you used the word untethered, but you were essentially like you were floating in space and you had nothing to hold you down anywhere and you're just floating. And I remember there's a suicidal ideation that happened and where to figure out how to ground yourself or where you can even throw an anchor down was not even in your vocabulary in a way there wasn't even in your head. You were just floating and you were talking to me in that I'm sitting in NASA at the ground control area and you're just kind of not in a ship anymore floating around in space I was talking to. But it was raw and it touched a chord with a lot of people. So just for everyone's benefit who has not listened to that yet, just give them like just a quick primer of like what had occurred. If you can do it in like 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I didn't even know what the problem was until just, a quick conversation, one that I can look back on now and see it was really very much rooted in the dynamics of the narcissist relationship. And somehow it just hit me in a way that was like, wait a minute, I think I have to have more conversations. And
With your dad.
Right, with my dad and really everyone in my immediate family. And so, yeah, that a few kind of conversations then with siblings about, our upbringing, the way our parents treated us, kind of the way they navigated through all of it was happening for the first time. And it was actually quite validating because I was starting to feel it and then to know, like, okay, yeah, this seems like something to talk about. And then ultimately, though, it sort of resorted back to the silencing. And by that point, though, I was at a place I could no longer stay silent. And it just really evolved into a very destabilizing experience. I ended up in the hospital. And when I got out, I found myself really the same idea of kind of trying to re anchor, reaching out to extended family. And again, this is one of these things I can look back in hindsight and see the depths to which intergenerational trauma really expands out, not just in the immediate family, but in my parents' siblings, aunts and uncles, etc. And ultimately, it led to a complete separation from everyone in my biological family. And since then, the waters have certainly calmed extensively, and it's been really just this journey of getting back in tune with my authentic self, the self I was always there, but not one I was honoring. And with that, it's certainly been challenging in many respects, but there's also been so much good. And I think that's really what's kind of motivated me to come back on and speak with you about the twofold aspect of this. It's one thing to become aware because I'm sure you could relate to this perspective as well that it's very lonely to go through something like that. And then as you kind of come out, start to become grounded and a little bit more in tune with authenticity, you see it's everywhere in so many ways in the way that people interact and kind of cope that there's actually been sort of this gratefulness for coming to this point of clarity at really a relatively young age. So yeah, it's a two-step forward, one-step back journey. But yeah, the beginning was as destabilizing of a crisis as I can really imagine.
So can you take us through like a step by step of what has occurred since you've been on the show and how all of these things did unfold in this twofold process?
Yeah, so yeah, first thing I really was trying to do, and again, I use that phrasing of anchoring this newfound reality because I think, like you said, floating in space is an exact, I think it's a perfect analogy for where we can find ourselves in those moments. And first thing I did, unfortunately, and to give myself some grace, was I turned back to what was familiar. I tried reaching back to my families, tried the whole convincing, and it really ended up becoming more hurtful, more invalidating. So I'd say after I spoke with you, it's probably only another 2 weeks or so of doing that. And then I found myself in a very lonely, yeah, untethered place. At the same time, I had direction for the first time. Crises are weird in that what is the translation? Is danger and opportunity, I believe, right? For the sort of excuse me, definition of a crisis. And I find myself looking back and seeing some of the beauty and the clarity that I was actually having of seeing what was going on. And then it's weathering that and then rebuilding. So I'd say there were months there really early on where it was just grasping at any way to really find community, find validation. And I did. One of the things I did first was start going to group meetings. I don't know if you've heard of ASCA, the Adult Survivors of Child Abuse. Looks like it's becoming a fairly extensive community of virtual meetings in person and sometimes, but just a community of people also who've experienced abuse in its many forms and coming together and really just validating one another. That was extremely important. The biggest, most concrete thing, though, was I got into therapy for the first time in my life. still doing it at least biweekly, if not more, and really self-reflecting. As much as the realization was about what happened to me, it was really when I look back today, and as I move forward, it's really the pain of what I was doing today as a result of what I learned as means of coping, survival, people pleasing, emotional suppression, anger that was getting misdirected at myself, my partner, my kids, and owning that, really realizing where it's coming from. And being that it's been almost 2 years now, there's been so many objective ways to see improvement, which has been extremely validating and good to reflect on. And at the same time, the temporal scales are still not weighed in favor of this authentic me. It's only been 2 years versus decades of the previous way of living. So it's really a practice of retraining the brain and becoming aware of, am I sitting in reality, or is this that trauma induced worldview that I used to rely so heavily on?
So it sounds like, because I'm just imagining you in front of me right now, my brain went to the movie The Village, and it's like you were living in that village, and everyone in that village who was the elder was like, well, you can't go into that forest because there's this terrible, scary thing there. So your world is only that village. And your brain has said, do you know what? There is nothing in that forest, and I'm just going to continue walking. And that has opened your brain up to the rest of the world, the rest of your thoughts, the rest of where your mind can actually go. It has freed your mind to explore. And that exploration has taken you, sometimes to good places, sometimes to bad places, but it's roaming around and it's hitting touch points. And those touch points are kind of getting hit in your brain. And whether they're good or bad, you're creating a new system. It's creating a new flow. And it's a world that is ever expanding because your brain can go anywhere it wants. And now you're, I guess, in that process of, well, I can go anywhere. Who am I? What am I? And the things that I've done or do in all of my habits, is that really me? Do I need to retrain where, because before all of my habits were in this little quadrant over here. Now, my default sometime is to go back to that little quadrant. I have to teach that little quadrant that, like, no, we can consistently go out into this new world and to, like, get yourself off of that because it's memory at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great analogy. And it's also validating and appreciating, as hard and somewhat paradoxical it may sound, but validating that part of me that does kind of want to shrink my world again, kind of back into the way things were, because at its core, that was survival. And it worked insofar as given the dynamics. And so without appreciating what that served for me, it's hard then to let go. And at the same time, it's so familiar. It feels quote unquote right at times. And yet I now have this intellectual awareness as well as sort of holistically feeling of just how fruitless it is today for me. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's continuing to kind of let that pendulum swing and get it kind of a little bit more stable rather than kind of swinging back and forth.
So, what are the things that served you that no longer serve you, that you don't want to do anymore, but you have to honor how they protected you? What were those things and how are you honoring them?
Yeah, that's an endless list, I think, as I continue to unfold. Well, certainly emotional suppression, growing up in those dynamics, you're not taught to honor your feelings or even be in tune with them, but rather suppress them for the sake of everyone around you. And carrying that into adulthood, it turns into people pleasing, it turns into workaholism, it turns into other means of coping that are just fruitless. But it's probably been the biggest one to work on getting back in tune with my gut. Survival meant ignoring that. And now it's honoring the very real anger that does still fester. It's also now becoming aware of where that anger should be directed and how to displace it. So certainly emotional suppression. I mean, that one I'm almost saying encompasses so many of the aspects. I, yeah, I mean, I would say honestly, and sometimes I think parsimony can be fruitful, right? To just keep it simple. It was honestly, we all have that gut feeling. We have it. I mean, ever since having kids, and to see it, it's there from day one to survive. And when you're not taught to honor that, listen to it, and stay in tune with it, it's catastrophe waiting to happen. And so, I would say honestly, that we're just really in tune with our authentic gut, what it means, what it's telling us, and how to interpret it more in reality rather than in sort of those trauma-induced flashbacks.
What's the scariest thing been?
I would say, it does go back to that point. As weird as it may sound, the scariest thing has been learning to sit in peace, being willing to be present, because a lot of the time we cope with that kind of anticipatory mindset, which fuels anxiety, which fuels sort of fear, and letting go of that has really, and I say that, of course, early on, and the first time I spoke with you, the scariest things were confronting biggest bullies in my life because they were the ones who I also turned to for safety, quote unquote, or what I thought of as safety. So certainly that was by far the scariest part of it all. And then with that, putting up the boundaries with virtually everyone who wasn't willing to, or it's not even willing to, as much as I see as being capable of sitting with this truth, because that leaves you up to your own sense of guidance. I had such a distrust in my own sense of self, my own way of viewing the world, that I wasn't living honoring that. And then when you are you put those boundaries up, you are on your own in so many ways. And that's scary at times. And at the same time, that's where all the reward comes from. I mean, you can see me. I look vastly different in many respects.
Everyone, you've turned into a hippie.
Yeah, I mean,
And I'm not joking. My first thing I was like, if I was Eric Cartman right now, I'd be probably saying like, "Damn hippie."
yeah, I mean, you're exactly, and it's funny, your voice has crept in many times because I think the first time we spoke and I was telling you what was going on, you had said you're going to be so different in the next over the time, and I didn't truthfully understand what that meant at the time, and now it's just like, yeah, yeah, and so many things I do, things I listen to, as far as music, things, hobbies that I'm getting back into, friendships that are evolving are not ones that I would have ever been able to kind of see as serving me in the past, and now today they're some of the most rewarding things, yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think when we grow up in environments like this, there's a point at which I'm able to reflect and say, every single thing I have in my life has been built around survival rather than thriving. And that includes the good things. There's so many things on paper about my life that by many standards are good. My career, my family. And At the same time, so much of it was sort of being built or scaffolded with fear, survival, and it's really a complete overhaul of all of that. Many of my I mean, I've had relationships, not and I don't say this with any anger, distaste, or anything, just as a stark reality that friendships that I had built around a trauma-induced worldview no longer serve me. They don't offer me the opportunities for growth, authentic attunement that I'm searching for, and that's okay. And it certainly some days it comes with a sadness and it comes with great opportunity too. So it's been truthfully rebuilding the partner I want to be, the father I want to be, colleague I want to be at work, and the friend I want to be.
So you were a workaholic before. So how has this affected work and people at work and the expectations of you from yourself in work? How do you view work now? And how have things kind of changed overall at your place of work?
Yeah, definitely would say I fit the realm of workaholic before, and it's one of those. I think it's one of the most difficult survival coping mechanisms to sit with and say this is indeed problematic because it comes with so much reward, and I put that in quotes in other ways. And so one of the things, I mean, I was so unstable in the beginning that I had to take a leave from work for quite some time, and coming back has been really rewarding in two ways. First, it's coming back and keeping in mind my authentic capacity, being willing to say no, not in a malicious way, as much as just honoring my boundaries. These are things that really, in the grand scheme of things, make a good person and good employee in many ways. And yet, for folks working through this, it's extremely scary. It can create those old fears that come back in. So that's certainly offered a two-step forward, one step back kind of journey. At the same time, I think I've never been more in tune with what I want out of work, what I want to do at work. One thing that I'm really grateful for at the same time is the kind of work I do. Being in academia has really offered an opportunity for me to get in line more with my authentic journey and bringing in the empirical side of it. And that's been extremely rewarding. I mean, my research agenda has entirely changed. My views on the topics that I research have completely changed in ways that not only align with literature that exists, but also what feels right. So that's been very fruitful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where that goes because I think it offers something very good professionally in that capacity. But more importantly, it's been extremely rewarding personally to start to blend authenticity into what I do on a day-to-day basis rather than, here's this workaholic who shows up today and then he goes home and sits with all the emotions that have been suppressed. So that gap has diminished considerably. So yeah, overall work has been much more rewarding.
And how have your views on the world changed?
Oh, that wow. Yeah, quite a bit. At first, I was very afraid of the world in so many ways because my world, and it was very small, and we all have that, right? But it was rejecting of my authenticity, my true take on what happened, and that was scary. And at the same time, as I've gone through this journey, I've sort of left thinking the world is actually much simpler than I had originally thought. Quite frankly, as lonely as this journey has been, I think I alluded to it a little bit ago, but there are so many of us coping in so many ways, whether it's through workaholism, whether it's through people pleasing. The awareness of that, certainly comes from each person. And capacity or desire to really look at the depths to what's going on. That varies, and it doesn't necessarily change, though, how many of us are sort of navigating this world in survival rather than thriving. So,
There's a lot of addicts in America. They're all coping and surviving as best they can. And right now it's too cold in this room that I'm sitting in to type in how many addicts are there in as a percentage of America. That's how cold it is in this room right now that I'm sitting in. But, there's just a lot of people out there that you have your coping mechanisms, and everyone has coping mechanisms. Sometimes a coping mechanism can be seen as healthy, but it's still a coping mechanism. Whether it be someone who overexercises, hey, that person's in great shape, but they're coping somehow, possibly. Someone who's overdoing something along those lines, society doesn't look at it in that way, but it's still a coping mechanism, and that people are doing it in different ways, whether they know it or not.
yeah, I think you're exactly right. And, it's really changed my views on the ways in which we view mental health and the ways in which we approach healing. I think the first time we spoke, it was depression, it was anxiety, suicide ideation. At the end of the day, though, really, the diagnosis has been bundled really into complex PTSD. And, I think it was Pete Walker's book on that topic that said, like, if we were to pause as a field in mental health and acknowledge complex trauma and what it does, we would get the DSM manual down to paper thin rather than, what we're seeing.
Yeah, there are a lot of people out there who would like to get rid of the DSM as a whole, including all of the personality disorders and everything. It's because it's all relational trauma of some sort that you people are where they are, and some people like to have those diagnoses. Some people like to put people into a specific box so they can understand things better, which is very understandable. But it's complex PTSD in some way that has occurred.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, so to give you some context on my own journey with that, I mean, I left the hospital being put on an antipsychotic that I was told I'll be on for life. I was off it within 5 months. And I don't say that to take away what medication does, because, from there I was finding other relief with SSRIs, SNRIs. And then as stability continued to grow, in part because I stuck the path of trauma, a lot of anxiety, seeing it not so much as a state of being or a character flaw, but rather as a survival mechanism that served me in the past. And so, I've been off those now and for 6, 7 months now. And, this is the first time in my life since I don't know, I was in my 20s that I had not been on anything. And again, that doesn't mean that I don't have days that I would say, well, I'm really feeling depressed today. What it does mean, though, is I have direction that has continued to peel back the onion to these things and create more of an emotionally stable, emotionally regulated person than I've ever been in the past. And it's all in stark contrast to really the early diagnoses that were occurring during the crisis. It wasn't until I got into therapy and things really settled down to say, like, just focus on the trauma and go from there. And yeah, I have found myself, and I don't know if this is more the the academic side of it, but the overdiagnoses, the over reliance on prescriptions without then diving into the past, the history is, I don't think, serving us well holistically. I mean, one of the books that really has resonated with me through this journey is Gabor Mate's work, The Myth of Normal, and all of his perspectives on what role trauma does. And, so many things, like you said, anxiety, borderline personality disorders, things of that nature, so much resonate with how people cope with trauma. And I think if we pause and say, well, this is what I have, it doesn't really open the avenue then to really say, this is what I'm doing as a result of what happened to me. Those are slightly different narratives. And I think the latter in particular is what opens the door for healing. And at the same time, Gabor's book says it perfectly. That's the myth of normal. Cutting out family is, not something you hear about all the time, right? Putting up such boundaries. And at the same time, it's been one of the most fruitful things for me when the waters get a little rough. I can pause and say, well, I'm out of it. I am safe right now. And then I can go from there. So I think it's really, it would be, one of the things I think could be most fruitful is seeing that work get embedded and, again, just kind of looking so not so much at what people are doing or how they're behaving, but asking the question, what happened to you? I mean, I can say firsthand, I didn't meet anybody in that hospital who didn't have a traumatic past from my conversations. And of course, it's an N of one, it's one stay. And then leaving and diving into the literature and seeing this in some fields, this is well known, but the extent to which it's operating in practice is the gap is monumental. And I think that's, what makes sometimes the healing journey most difficult is the resistance built around the normality of coping.
And before we leave today and get to your second words of wisdom, you mentioned music before, that your music has changed, that you listen to. I'm just in my own curiosity of what it has changed to, besides your hair and a tattoo there. You've gone from being a mild mannered educator to a combination of Jefferson Airplane and Lincoln Park. So that's my guess. So where am I on that guess?
It's funny. I don't think it's as much to that my music. I think when I say it's changed, what I mean primarily is the ownership of it and what it's served for me as my authentic self. I always have loved music and got away from it a little bit over the years. And actually, I think I mentioned towards the end of the first time we spoke that I turned to guitar playing in particular as a means of pleasing, particularly my father. And as I've let go of that being the motive and owned kind of, I just love doing this, it's become extremely rewarding. I found myself getting much more back in touch with friends from high school who I shared that with. And it's been extremely rewarding to kind of find that love again. I also, have really owned the music I've loved my whole life, sort of in a closet form, so to speak. I went to my first Blink-182 concert this past year, the first time in my life, and they've been one of my favorite groups and really kind of the core of why I've gotten so involved in drum playing, etc. And so I think it's really just been kind of ownership of it in much more of an authentic way, finding that joy.
You had to remove the people pleasing aspect of it, the music, because that wasn't for you and you had to actually really enjoy it for yourself. It sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been extremely rewarding. It's not only just for myself, but with my kids. It's one of our rituals of going down and jamming out for better or for worse. My kids can sing along to Blink songs and it's fun. And also it's cool to introduce them to music in a way that, to see them come through and really kind of find joy in it in the same way I do. So it's really turned into this familial thing for all of us.
So if you had a second words of wisdom, what would they be?
Yeah, it would be that gut feeling we have throughout the day in every single thing. It's not there out of to cause problems. It's telling us something about ourselves in particular. And getting back in tune with that is huge. And so I searching for that misalignment in ourselves is huge. And there are so many things, even though I spend a lot of time talking about how I think we are detached from what we're doing with trauma healing. in practice, there are some really great resources available right now. One of the things I did over the last summer was a week of intensive trauma therapy, which was centered around eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, and it's huge. We all have those things we can look back on that kind of charge our body. Let's call it what it is, which is trauma. And it's worth sitting with and understanding why and moving on. I mean, that's not, this isn't to recreate a life that's rooted in trauma as much as move on, get to living.
Well, Daniel, I really want to thank you for being here with us today, coming back, reaching out, sharing your healing process, everything to do with trauma, and going through everything in the dealing with the difficulty of what healing is, and that it's not going to be one forward process. So there's going to be a lot of steps back, but you've given hope to a lot of people that that they can do it too, because it's a scary thing to do what you did and to kind of sever everything with your family and tackle everything. And you were in a dark place. Even when I saw you, you weren't in a stable place. We'll put it that way. So I know everyone out here is cheering for you and rooting for you, and you're an inspiration to everyone out there. So a big thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. That means a lot. And thank you for what you do. I mean, you provide a platform to anchor something for people when they're in space. And that's been huge for me. And it's really helped build a foundation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for being our guest today. And we'll have all of the books mentioned in the show notes. And just a reminder, if you want to join our newsletter on our website, go to our website. It's a new newsletter, weekly newsletter. Includes a workbook for our Survivor Story episodes that will be coming out. So far, people have found these workbooks very helpful. They can be a very valuable tool in understanding what's happened in your relationship, and it is free. So go to our website, and on the front page there, just sign up to our newsletter, or there'll be a drop down as well, or we'll just put a link in our show notes too. And that is it for today's episode. So for myself and Daniel, we hope you have a good night.